Alrighty, boyos. The only people who can hear me right now are the ones who seen this after it's uploaded. So, hi, where are people at? One second. Let me get Google. Here we go. Critter, Adam Johnson, Flippy, Avatrax, Tim, Kelsey, Agility, Bark. No, I didn't. I got this idea from 29 Planets. I started watching this today. Hey, it's a break from Mineplex. Waff, what's up, my dude? Plish. Oh my god, Plish, you're here. Leah, I'll do it. I will hit 1,000. I will hit 1,000. Okay, I will hit 1,000. Destro, I would love to talk after the stream. I swear I will be able to talk with you after the stream. Sure thing, Destro. I will get to 1,000. For everyone joining, Idiotic plays. Sorry, the Idiotic what plays? How's it going, my dude? Seeing you around. Welcome back to another stream. Welcome everyone, guys. We got Critter, Flip, my band, Flippy, Adam, always here, my dude. You really should get mods soon. Tim, I love you too. Guys, Kelsey's here. Volk, don't worry about Volk. Everyone donated $5 every 50 times. I have to hit 1,000, so I have to say, Mr. Quack 22, 5,000 times. Not 5,000, 1,000 times. And all you have to do, I end the stream at 1,000 times. When I say Mr. Quack 22, 1,000 times, I win and I can end the stream. But like, I will non-stop. I will end the stream in 10 hours if I have to, if you guys stop me from hitting 1,000. So let's do this. Volk, you enjoy your baseball. We're gonna start now. Keep talking in chat. Like the video, share this stream right now. I'm gonna share it with a bunch of my in real life friends, see if any of them join the stream, and we will start in less than a minute. We'll see. I am insane, guys. Collab 420 World Star. What else? Okay, we're gonna start. $5, the link's in the description. If I hit 1,000, I get on the stream. If not, every time someone donates $5, I have to reset this. Let's start. Mr. Quack 22, 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 Mr. Quack. Can I just do Mr. Quack? Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack 22, Mr. Quack 22, Mr. Quack 22, Mr. Quack, 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 not Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Why you want my Snapchat, B? Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. I kind of want to raise it to $10. This is harder than I thought. Mr. Quack. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Cosmetic YT, what's up? Dude, you made Twitter. That's awesome. I don't use my Twitter anymore. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Olay, what's up, my dude? Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. For anyone joining, we're trying to 1,000 times. If you want to reset it, you donate $5. Boom, it's just like that. And I'm gonna hate everyone. Whoever donates, I'm gonna add you to a little leaderboard, okay? Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Destro, please don't do this to me. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. I'd rather say sub to PewDiePie. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. That Nerfer, what's up? Welcome to the stream, my dude. How's everyone stay? Lazy Diamond Land. You've been here for a while. Appreciate you coming back. I hate this. Dallas Banks, what's up, my guy? I remember you. Don't worry, don't worry. Welcome back, welcome back. Welcome back, everyone. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. 16 watching, guys. Let's get to 20. Get this stream viral. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Dean Bean, what's up, my dude? Dude, your channel's doing great. I applaud you. I'm very proud of you. Where you're at right now, that takes some tough work, dude. I'm definitely proud of you. I'm doing fine down here, you know, at 5,000, but you know, that's fine. Yeah, you got verified? Dude, I remember that they're weak. You definitely passed 100,000. I weren't sure if you were verified, though. Yeah, I didn't know if you, like, applied for that or something. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Ah, it's Mr. Willie Shakes. Hi, Don B, what's up? Welcome to the stream. These streams are lit. Guys, it's her first one. Everyone welcome her. Let me zoom in on this a bit. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. I missed two. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Can I do 500? Mr. Quack, Mr. Crack, I'm doing 500. 1,000's way too much. Let me just change the title. Hey, I'm still saying it 500 times. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. 500,000's way too much. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Fine, I'll do 1,000. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. I'll do 1,000. I'll do 1,000. I'll do 1,000. Okay, it's at 1,000. Welcome to the stream, guys. Thank you for all the support. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. I want 157. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Calculated shots, you're the new boss apparently. Cool. Oh, Plish, Dallas, you guys know each other. That's awesome. I'm doing 1,000. Bark, I realized that. You know someone that did 100,000? Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Don't you do this to me. I'd rather you guys do it like right now. I can't end the stream until it's over. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Yes, laugh, I agree. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack with Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Pokemon, I'm blind, Mr. Quack. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. I said crack. God damn it. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Why do you want my Snapchat? DM me on Discord. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. I'm not saying it on stream. There's 23 of you. Alay, save me. Damn, Tim. You would do that. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. You know what? If I stopped talking to you guys, I'd go faster, but I'm a nice person. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Guys, get this to 30 viewers. Do it. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Okay, who changed her? Who's that mod? You're Starzak. Sweet, dude. Starzak's welcome back. Appreciate you. Yeah, give away $100. Yeah, I'm fine with that. We're splitting it though. I get 50. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Quister Mac, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. We have 1,000. Oh my god. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Slurp crack. Crap, that's not good. Oh my god, it's a fake Mr. Beast. Yo, what's up? Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Hey, that's funny because Mr. Beast said sub to PewDiePie a bunch. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. No, Plish, I'm a big fan of you. That's why I posted a video with you in it. Mr. Quack, 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 Crack, Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. That doesn't even sound like a name anymore. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. This is why I want to do 500. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Okay, I'm sharing. I'm gonna put this on my Instagram. I'm gonna put this on my main, on my story. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. I forgot to hit it. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Hey, speaking of Mr. Quack, it sounds like I'm saying Mrs. Quack. One second. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Alright, I'm putting it. Hey, if you guys have social media, everyone right now make a post. You can like delete it later, be like, everyone join this guy's stream. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Okay, I'm just gonna put... I'm making a post on my main. I'll delete it later. 5. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Plasma Destiny, hi! Welcome to another stream. Alright. I posted Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. All my in real life friends, you can see if it's there. It's not a link. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Let me put this link. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. This is why I want to do 500. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Ah! I need to like... Fish lasagna part 2. Yeah, we'll do fish lasagna part 2. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. You changed your username from what? Mr. Quack, 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 Dasher, sex me. Mr. Quack, corrupted destiny. Oh, it's roughly the same thing. Dasher, why are you doing this to me? Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Hey, notification squad. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Yeah, we need some like Christmas music. Oh yeah, I'm gonna get some Christmas music. How do I... Ah! What was that? Plasma Destiny, thank you for the sub, my dude. Appreciate it. Thank you. Yo, this... What? Did it pop up twice? Clay Keat. Yo, Clay, what's up? Clay, I know I'm in real life. I haven't talked to him in a while though. Clay, welcome to the stream. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Yeah, I'm just saying my channel name a bunch. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Like cold, my dude, what's up? Microcycle, welcome to. Can I not do 10? I don't want to do 1,000. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. 1 second. I'm posting this everywhere. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Maybe I will. Nerd. I hate wearing this backwards because I have so much hair. Not really. I have like no hair. You guys should see me in real life. A few of you guys know me in real life. Just steal my dad's credit card. Okay. 1,000's a lot. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. I forgot. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. I said it 400 times. Gosh. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. I'll move my chair. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Please. Okay. What we're gonna do, since 1,000 is so much, it's gonna take a while, right? I've already been streaming for 15 minutes. I'm not even halfway. We're gonna do $10, but it could be from different people. Okay? I think that's fair. $10 for 1,000. I'll still do 1,000, alright? Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. It's fair enough. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. I'll do 5,000 for 50 bucks. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Guys, the things I do for money. You guys know in real life I don't have any money. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Sorry, Destro. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. So if you guys want to contribute, you can just do like $1. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. No! No. Hey, it's $4.99. No, just kidding. I gotta restart. No, Clay. Clay, you're like the last person I think would do this. Ah, it hurts so much. It hurts so much. No. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Mr. Quack Clay, I hate you, but thank you for the $5, my dude. God, no. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, greatest purchase yet. Dude, that's, oh my god. That's not a waste at all. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. I'm actually surprised we got people from, in real life that I actually know on stream. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. I'm just gonna go ham. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. God, Clay, don't do this to me. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack 22. If I did 22, Mr. Quack 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 22, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack 22, Mr. Quack 22, Mr. No, it's faster. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Yeah, can we have 50 likes? Alonzo, what's up? Guys, it's Mineplex Mod. How's it going, my dude? Quack, your stream says you would say Mr. Quack 1,000 times for $10. 1,000. I want to hit 1,000. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Alex, to play Despacito. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. You right, you right, you right. Leah, you smart. You smart, Leah. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Doesn't even sound like it. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. I'm gonna need a new space bar because I've hit it too much. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Thank you, Leah. Mr. Quack, Despacito. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Gucci gang, Gucci gang, Gucci gang. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Flesh, you genius. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Welcome to the stream, Vandaman, what's up? Mr. Quack, 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 with Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. What? Wasn't that from a while ago? Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Let me check stream elements. Mr. Quack. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. One second. My dashboard. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. I'm just double checking. I think it's just that once. Why are you still watching this, Tanvi? Mr. Quack, Gucci Gang Liam. Hey, what's up, my guy? I don't know. I don't know why you guys want. Why are you guys watching this? Okay, I need to go faster. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Why couldn't I have had an easier name? Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Yo, we got someone from Chile. Dead Cow 31. Welcome, my guy. Guys, we got someone from South America. Dang. You right. You right. Mr. Quack, Cookie Queen, what's up? I had some music going. I don't know what happened to it. Can I just keep going through all these? It's just on a playlist. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Nice job, you got timed out. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Mac, Quack, Mr. Mac, Mr. Quack, Mr. You guys are all getting muted by stream elements. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Can I like play? There we go. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. I'm actually an old sub, but my English was not that good back then. Well, hopefully it is now. Seems like it. Welcome to the stream. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. I hate this so much. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Okay, there's no way in heck we're hitting 1,000. I'm doing it back to 500. Trust me, we're never gonna hit 1,000. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Please don't get mad at me. You try doing it. Try saying just like your YouTube name 30 times. It sucks. A whey protein, a whey protein. It's funnier in my head. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Why? Oh my god, fine. You guys don't understand my suffering. Okay, you gotta do 10 to reset then. Guys, I'm sorry. This is hurting my head. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. I'm gonna start crying. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. I'm saying quack, don't worry. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, it sounds like that. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Quack. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Mr. Quack 22, 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 Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. I'm gonna say Mr. Quack 22, 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 Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack 22, Mr. Quack 22, Mr. Quack 22. Sky Factory. Dead Cow's been here before all of you guys. That was before I started streaming. That's before 300 subs. Dude, it's been a while. You're probably the most long-time viewer here. Mr. Quack 22, Mr. Quack 22. Leah, what am I checking? Leah, can you explain that like a little more? I don't know what you mean. Probably because my brain dead because I've said this too much. 5,000 times for each subscriber? Are you kidding? You're crazy. No, he's been here like before anyone. Like before I even had a viewer base. I got like 40 views per video. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack 22, 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 Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, yes, Gucci Gang Liam, Mr. Quack 22, Mr. Quack 22, Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Sorry, people are actually responding to my post I made. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. I know, I love Sky Factory a lot. It gets boring though. It gets boring, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, whenever there's like nothing else to do. It's fun at the beginning, but then it's like, you have nowhere to mine, there's no real exploring. That's the thing. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. It takes 10 to reset now, remember that. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, welcome to stream! Whoever just came. I've been here since Clash of Clans. That's a long time ago. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Chili Tree, what's up? How's it going, Chili Tree? Okay, but it's already at 10. Here, someone donated 5 earlier, and we were going to do 10, so it's 10, and then it's going to be 11, and then 12, and so on. Alright. I am the Legend 27, the earliest meme. It's good stuff. Alright. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Waffles, don't worry about it. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack 22, 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 Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, yes I did. Mr. Quack, don't judge me. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Yes I did, Leah. Mr. Quack, I'm checking Discord. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. How's my dad not yelling at me yet? Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack 22, 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 Mr. Quack 22. Hardened Chicken 66, what's going on? I'm turning this down a bit so I could hear myself. Mr. Quack 22, Mr. Quack 22, I did hit 420. Hey, girls do it too. Excuse me. I hate wearing my hat like this. I was watching a stream and I'm like, I don't have a real job. I kind of need a source of income. I'm probably not going to do this again. I'll maybe do like, if there's a huge thing with like the whole sub to PewDiePie to beat tier series, I'll say it 100,000 times. I would do that. I would do that. Alright. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Yeah, I got gnomed. No, someone said that they got gnomed, so I just clicked on it and just went with it. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. You would do it, Mr. Quack. I can literally only end the stream at 1,000. Wait, this can go on for 5 hours. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. I'm raising you $1 every time it's reset though. Or maybe 5. I might do 15. We'll see how much I'm struggling. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. 1 second. I want to see if I can zoom in more. Yeah, that's all I can do. Sorry. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. We're making progress. It's the farthest we've gotten. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Or I should do like $5 takes off 500 or like $2 takes off 200. But I can't do that. I have to reset it. Never mind. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. How do you get the thing to get your stream to show the spacebar counter? I just went on a website and I'm just doing my desktop and it's just in full screen. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. What? I've checked Discord. I don't want to keep pausing. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Bark, I'm no way doing that. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Mr. Quack, Plish, maybe. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. It is a tough life. Plasma. Mr. Quack. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Oh, I love that song. I'm skipping it though because it's so good. There we go. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Vandaman, shout out to you guys. Go subscribe to Vandaman. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. In your picture, it looks like a little kid taking a shit. I don't know. I've always thought that. Gonna be offline for a while. Wi-Fi's getting upgraded. Sweet, Waff. Go on your phone. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack 22, Mr. Quack 22, Mr. Quack 22, Mr. Quack 22. I'm gonna be so tired tomorrow. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Who's still here? Give me a thumbs up. And I'm sorry. Gosh, Mom, why don't you let me curse? Why don't you let me curse? You guys are so mean. Oh, that's definitely Arjun. That's Arjun. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Welcome to the stream. If you guys are new, please leave a sub. Please don't donate unless you want to reset it. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. What the heck? We have someone verified. What the heck? Someone check him out. I don't even care anymore. Thank you for the thumbs up. Evan, what's up? Yo, we got a bunch of people from Instagram, I think. I am a sellout. Thanks very much. That's a thumbs down. That's not good. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Hey, 20 viewers, what's up? Welcome everyone. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. I'm getting so tired. You don't understand. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. You used to play Minecraft Hypixel with me. Evan N. I don't know if I remember that name. I think I might. I recognize it. Mr. Quack. I almost said Evan N. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. We're getting close, more than halfway. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Thank you for the thumbs up, everyone. Why? You want me to shout out a friend? Yo, if you guys have like a brother or sister, you want to like bring them over? Like, they could see my pain. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. I don't think I remember that name, Evan. Sorry. No, I recognize it. I think I do. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Possibly. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Hey, 600, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. It's 10 to reset. We're getting close. I'm just gonna like delay the stream and I'm gonna hold it down. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. I do agree with the idea. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack 22, 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 Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. I'm gonna put on like 5 hats. We could put on. There we go. Here we go. I got a hat. There we go. There we go. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. I'm gonna go like this. This will fit better. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Wait, I can do like. Wait, I can do like this. It like blends. Wait, where's the hat? It's right here. I can go like that. Thank you. Root the Turtle, yo, I remember you. How's it going, my dude? Where's my other earbud? Welcome back to another stream. Mr. Quack. Sorry, guys, I'm like trying to barely respond because like I really want to hit 1,000. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. I'm reading every chat though. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. 666, hey, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. I'm doing good, thank you, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. I cannot help your friend to get 600, I'm sorry, I don't really do shoutouts unless it helps me or if I really know them. I'm sorry. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. They should do what I do and put in the hard effort. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, welcome to Stream Cosmetic. You've already been here, but that's okay. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, I'm sorry, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Why do I have this hat? Too many hats. I got this hat for like $10 at Walmart. This is not even my hat, but I have a huge hat rack right there. We're right there. So I just got it from there. Yes, I have a sick Godzilla poster over there. I have a bunch of great posters. Don't worry. Mr. Quack, 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 700, let's go! Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, we're getting there, guys. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. I'm sorry you have a whole rack of hats that you only wear in the burger one. I'll do it. I'll wait for the views. No Quack window, you know me when I need to go on my channel, back everybody out. There's too many people to help out. Why, if I'm gonna help someone, then I have to help everyone. Yes, Mineplex brought back their new lobbies. I was gonna stream today on it. Sorry, I'm just like going crazy over stuff. Half of you don't know what I'm talking about. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Time to put on like 5 hats. Like in my old diss track. We do this. They're all baseball hats. I used to play baseball for like 10 years. Alright, that's good. That's good. I can't even look down. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. I could do like some backwards. That one's on top. That'll be sideways. That go like that. There we go. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Okay, you know what we're gonna do? I need non-copyright music, but I was going to play Country Roads. Non-copyright Country Roads. I don't want to take a chance. I don't want to take a chance. Do we just go for it? We're gonna do, well, what can we do? So any song requests? Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Quack, look at what I said to you. What'd you say? On Discord? Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. It's only a bunch of hats. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Hellcat's a good song. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. You want to say it 100 times? Okay, I'll call you on stream. You could say it. What the heck? Plasma? I don't know what that is. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. David Trader, hi. How's it going? Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Sorry, I want to hit 1,000, so I'm trying not to talk. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Catch and release. Is that a song? I'm confused. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack 22, 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 Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Rohit, hey! Rohit. I don't know if you've ever been here. Welcome though. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. I'm in my room. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. 800, my guys. 828 hats. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, 22 Quack. Sorry, I always wanted to do that. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. If any of you guys have moderator or helper on my Discord, can you make an announcement tab at everyone to watch the stream? Again, because I'm too lazy. Different wall? No, I just have these little foam things. It's lit. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Spade, don't worry. Hi, Rohit. Yes, I know. Rohit, I know. Hi. Hi, sir. Don't worry why I'm wearing a hat. Thank you, Leah. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Rohit. God dang it. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Hey, we're at 828 now. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. $10 reset, guys. If we hit it, then we're done. Read the title on the stream. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Oh, what's with the hats? Oh, I just put on a bunch of hats. I'm gonna start taking them off. We got this one, Florida Gators. We got Arizona Diamondbacks when I play baseball. Florida. #1 daddy. Here, we'll wear the #1 daddy one. Okay. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. It's no for me today. Also, can you help me get subs? Cosmetic, I can't. If you guys want to go sub to Cosmetic, though, if you guys want to sub to each other, go for that. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. There's stuff on my keyboard. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. I was looking at someone's snap on stream. Are you kidding me, Waffles? No. No, it's $10. 5 more, 5 more, 5 more. I'm glad I did not reset. 5 more still reset. 5 more. He contributed. Thank you, Waffles, for the $5. Holy crap. Yo, guys, everyone put this on your stories and poop. And sorry, poop. It's another word for the S word, because I'm a good Minecraft Christian boy. Thank you very much. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Guys, we're 140 away. I gotta do it quickly. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Links in the description. Yeah, I'm such a sellout. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, this Mr. Quack. No, no, no. RG strafed, appreciate it. No. I hate you guys so much. Like, waffles, why? This hurts. Okay, now it's 11. Do I really have to do this? Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Oh yeah, Plish wanted to say it. Let me hit 100 so it's like even. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack 22, 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 Mr. Quack 22. Yes, please F in chat. Pay respects. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Maybe we could play Kahoot after this. I don't know. Whatever you guys want to do. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Plus, I'll call you in a minute. Welcome to the stream, whoever just joined. Please end my suffering by not doing anything. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. No. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. I feel like I should do 15. No, we're keeping it 11. I'm too nice. Earthfleck, what's up? Mr. Quack, yes I know. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. I'm gonna want to change my name. Mr. Quack. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Alright, Plish, I'm calling you. Alright, here you go, Plish. What? Okay, you ready to say it 100 times? I got the counter.
Yes, okay, I'm ready. Here we go.
All right.
Okay.
Alright, I'm ready.
Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack.
Keep going, you're at 140, you're at 140.
Mr. Quack, 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 Quack, Mr. 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 Quack. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack.
5 more.
Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, and Mr. Quack Dab.
Okay, 201. Plish, why? Plish, you're insane. Okay, sorry, that just gave me a little break. Now I have to do it 800 times. How many times have I said it total? Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Can I just say quack? Quack, 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 Mr. 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 Quack. Dude, I had to do it 1,000 times. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Let me see if anyone replied to my main. Hey, I got another heart. Mr. Quack, 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 the voice is hurting. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, my throat is hurting. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, chat's dying, that's okay. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. I might turn off the stream elements thing. I don't want you guys to get timed out. I don't know. You guys can spam all you want. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. I need some music. Alright, I just found some random NCS music. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Thank you, Leah, so much. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Thanks, Plish. If I ever get tired, I'll call you. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Miss her quack. Miss her crack. I'm counting that. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack 22, Mr. Quack 22. Mr. Quack 22 is easier to say, but it's longer. Mr. Quack 22, 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 Mr. Quack 22. Games does Roblox. Hi, welcome to the stream. Please end my suffering. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. I said crack, I know. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Stop saying crack in chat. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Who's still on stream? Everyone's leaving. Oh god. Well, like one person left who just doesn't let me end it. You guys are all gonna be gone. You guys are gonna wake up tomorrow morning with the stream on. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. I'm gonna start sleeping. Mr. Quack, 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 Lily, hi, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, 400. God. Am I allowed to up it to 15 now? Increase it by 5 every time? Please. It's up to you guys. Because I feel like someone's gonna have like a $50 American Express gift card, some Visa gift card, and they're just gonna use it all. You know what? No. No. We're not doing that. No and yes. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. We're gonna stick to 11, and then it's gonna be 15 after that. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. I'm not even halfway. That's why. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. 420 boys. 420 blaze it. I'm dying. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. All right, 15. Since Waffle said he's gonna do it, it's gonna be 15, then 20, and then 25 and 30. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. I probably won't do this well. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. I've said it 2,000 times almost. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Yes, I'm getting tired of saying this. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Then again, whoever's ever donated is getting put on the leaderboard. I'll make some kind of leaderboard. It'll be like first place, person who made me suffer the most, second, whatever else. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. You're right. Flish, I probably have missed one by now. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. I hate that word. Yuka, 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 yuka. I'd rather say yuka. My other name for other games. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Hey, stream's coming back up. Welcome everyone. Back, probably. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. I want to put this on my Instagram, my story. I think that'd be better. How do I use story? I don't use Instagram too often. At least anymore. Here, add to your story. Mr. Quack. And then I gotta do Quack 22. Yes, I'm counting that. Okay, your story. Boom, done. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. You will not donate if I do 50 push-ups? What? I'm confused. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Shoot, extra 999. Yeah, whatever. I'm getting a little sad. You're right, Leah. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Yeah, I agree with stream elements and my suffering. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Yeah, but like, it's still 15. Here, if I ever get... Okay, like, I'm not done yet. But like, if it gets to a point where it's like 999, then I have to reset it, and I'm just like so frustrated, I'll do 50. That's tough. 50 push-ups or 15? Or my suffering? We're gonna keep going. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Waffles, by the way, thank you for everything you've donated in the past. You've donated hundreds, which is like, I don't even know how you could do that. Like, I donate a lot, like $2 donations, $1, $2, $5 to like fellow streamers and like Derp Cake or something. This is just crazy. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. There's 555. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. I was waiting for that to happen. Excuse me. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. God, Waffles. No, we're gonna keep going. You think I won't? I'm gonna win this until I hit 1,000. My goal is to hit 1,000. Your goal is to stop me, or just like realize that it's just a sellout. What? Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Let's see what else we can do to make the stream entertaining. Okay, sure. How about this? If anyone donates $1, I'll say your name 100 times, which will replace. So for me to get to 600 to 700, I'll say someone else's name instead 100 times. So if you have a stupid name like I Pro Waffles, sorry, it's not a stupid name. It could like replace. I don't know. I could say your real name, your YouTube name, whatever. You right, Waffles. Oh god, my voice is hurting a bit. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. It's only one. Like, oh, what am I doing? I'm so stupid. You can tell me I'm stupid in the chat, I don't care. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Stop, please. No. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. You would do that. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Hey, bud. Hi. It's Lily. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Yes, Plasma. I see you guys. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. 666. Hey, what's up, Mr. Quack? What's up, Mr. Quack? Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Sorry, I thought there was a Chrome on my computer. It was my mouse. I'm so stupid. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Thanks, Leah. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. I just want to say something else than Mr. Quack. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Mr. Quack, 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 Vedic, hey, Vedic! Please end my suffering. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Vedic. It's so nice of you to join. God. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. I think I'll be free Monday, not tomorrow though. Maybe tomorrow, probably not. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Read the title if you guys are confused. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. I think I just skipped one. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Yes, LA, because I got reset. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. 3/4 away bear. Okay. We're gonna do an exercise. We're gonna breathe and then say 10 and then breathe again. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Mr. Quack, 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 Quack, Mr. 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 Quack. By the way, if there's delay with your donation and I hit 1,000, doesn't count. But like if you want, I can like either refund you or oh my god, you subscribed. I thought that was a donation. Thank you, Vedic, so much. I'm surprised you weren't already subscribed. Appreciate it, Vedic. Welcome to the Quack Screw. Welcome to some weird wannabe YouTube, Twitch famous star YouTube channel. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. It's definitely not a quick cash grab. No. You know, Plasma. It kind of is. Not really. I got the idea. I'm like, I also wanted to test if people would really pay to watch me suffer. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Stream Elements isn't even a person. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Medic, okay. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. How do you stop me? You have to donate. Now it's $11. We added it. Or no, it's 15. It goes from 10 to 15 to 20 to 25 every time it gets reset. Should I stop at 15? I think we're gonna do 15 and then just 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. Because by the time it gets to like 20, 25, 30, I'd feel too bad. We'll do 15 and then add one every time. I'm probably gonna end in like an hour. I think that's when it's gonna stop. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Ozair! Ozair! How have you not been subbed? Ozair! Ozair, I love you so much. Ozair, thank you. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Ozair, you're the new boss. You're right below me, I think, right? Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Vanderman, welcome back, Mr. Quack. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Yeah. Yeah, we only encourage bullying here. Yeah, we only encourage bullying. Thanks, Leah. No, who cares about Stream Elements? No, they're better than Streamlabs. In some ways, most shapes or forms. Though Streamlabs was slightly better in other ways. Ozair, say something in chat. What's up? Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Thanks, Leah. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. 10 watching, guys. Stream's dying. That's okay. Shoot, I might hit 1,000. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Destro's doing it to 2,000. Are you kidding me? Oh my gosh. Yeah, but I'm better than Destro, so I mean, thank you very much. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. We're getting close. Vedic. Don't mute Vedic. Oh my god. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Please don't mute people unless like I tell you you can do it. 1,800, wow. I've done more than that. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. We hit 900. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Yo, Isaiah, where are you at? Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Oh god. Oh god. Oh god. Are you kidding me? God, I just lost my voice after that. Are you kidding me? Acid Cookie, you haven't even said anything on stream. Okay, let's see the two messages. Canadian 13.99. XD reset, baby, you're babby, babby, you're bad. I don't even care. Why? Acid Cookie, thank you for the $13.99. Oh, and then Waffles with the $14.99. That's how Mafia works. I expect $10 within PayPal within the week. Destro had to reset. Acid Cookie, you haven't even said anything. You genius. You mastermind genius little hacker. Okay, I reset it twice. Do I have to like hit 1,000 and then reset it without donations and then go again? I mean, you both did it, so like, I don't know how that works. Stream, let's like decide what. Please don't like make me like. I'm pretty stressed. That was so hard. What do we gotta do? That's what, like $30, $28? 15, 14 is 29. What should we do? I have to keep going till I hit 1,000. Oh my god. What do we do? Waffle, smart. Okay. You gotta stop me though. You gotta stop me before 1,000. And then we gotta decide, does it stay at 15 or is it 20 now? I'll say both your names. Acid Cookie, I was gonna say your name 500 times. Well, Flying Cars 1980. No, we just have stupid streams like this. Welcome to stream 20. I think it should be 20 now. I'm also saying your names for the donations, so I gotta say Waffles 500. You're fine? Alright. Oh my god, Ezzy, what's up? Just wanted to do it. Dude, thank you, like, thank you so much. You're a frickin' G. Appreciate the donation. Like, seriously, thank you so much. Why the heck did you have to do this to me, though? Okay, I'll say Acid Cookie, here, if you're gonna leave, I'll say, like, your name, like, the first 100, then you can go. And then Waffles, I'll do the 400. And then I'll say my name 500. Love you too, son. Oh my god, Waffle. Here, Waffles, I'll call you.
Hello?
Why? 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 Why do you do this to me? Why? Why?
I don't know. I mean, what are the reasons to need? I'm sporting my epic brand new hoodie. It's pretty epic.
No.
Got that fucking Neko Para represent.
I hate you so much. Yeah. Oh my god. Here, wait. Let me go stream elements because it's muting all you guys or timing you guys out. Let me just take that off. Spam filters. I'm just gonna turn that all off.
This is amazing.
All right, there you guys go. This is not amazing.
I do gotta say, I didn't expect the other guy to donate too.
Yeah, dude, it just came all of a sudden. I freaked out. Okay, I gotta start. Okay, so I'm gonna end the call. Anything you would like to say? Hey, you got your face on stream. Am I allowed to show it for a couple seconds?
Yeah, that's fine. I don't care. I hit 100 subscribers. You better go subscribe. Epic dab.
Epic gamer moment. Oh god, guys.
It's laggy on the stream.
Yeah, no, it lagged for a tiny bit, for a tiny second. But dude, congrats. Right. I remember when I hit 100. It was fun. I'll see you later though, right?
See ya.
Appreciate it. Yeah, I would love to hit 1,000. All right, $20 now. I gotta say, what was it? Acid Cookie. Why did I forget that? All right. Who's that cutie? Yo, where's that Zara at? Vedic, I think it's me. Thank you very much. Acid Cookie, Acid Cookie, Acid Cookie. That's way harder. Acid Cookie, 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 Acid Cookie. This is so hard to say. Acid Cookie, Acid Cookie. The guy in the video. I don't know who that is. It says #1 daddy. Acid Cookie, Acid Cookie, Acid Cookie. Hey, we're back at 16 viewers. Leave a like. Can we hit like 50 likes? I'm gonna drop and add everyone in the Discord again. What? The thumbnail didn't? Oh no, yeah, that was the thumbnail. Okay. Acid Cookie, Acid Cookie, Acid Cookie, Acid Cookie. Present, what's up? Ask a cookie, ask a cookie, ask a cookie. Acid Cookie, Acid Cookie, Acid Cookie, Acid Cookie. I need more food. Acid Cookie, Acid Cookie. I'm saying your name. Welcome back, son. Acid Cookie, Acid Cookie, Acid Cookie. Please like coordinate who's gonna do the $20. Alright. This is probably the most dumb, stupid idea I've ever done. Acid Cookie, 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 Acid Cookie. This is so bad. What? Acid, 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 cookie, 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 acid, 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 cookie, 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 acid, 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 cookie, 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 acid, 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 acid. Wait, I messed up there. Acid, 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 cookie, 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 acid, 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 cookie, acid, cookie, acid, cookie, acid, cookie, acid, cookie. Acid, 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 cookie, 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 cookie. I like that's way more fun. Hi, it's Alt. Oh my god. Hyper waffles, hyper waffles, hyper waffles. That's so cancerous. Hyper waffles, hyper waffles, hyper waffles. Sounds bad actually. Acid Cookie, Acid Cookie, hyper waffles, hyper waffles, hyper waffles, hyper waffles, hyper waffles, hyper waffles. That's not that bad. Hyper, 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 waffles, 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 waffles. Hyper waffles, hyper waffles, hyper waffles. Why am I checking Discord? You're not wrong. Okay. I'm gonna start putting the stream in all these Discords.
somewhere.
Guys, I need you to join the stream right now. That was great. I'm really suffering. Oh, there! Hyper waffles, hyper waffles, hyper waffles. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. I joined a call with my friend. There was like 4 or 5 of them. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Hyper waffles, 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 hyper waffles. Mr. Quack, 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 quack. It's like when Haley said my name in that one video. Quack, quack, and then I ear raped Windows ear rape startup. I remember. You guys hated me in the comments. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Waffles, 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 waffles. I pro, hyper waffles, hyper waffles, hyper waffles, hyper waffles. A zircon, 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 a zircon. Leah, 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 Laney, 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 Laney. Acid cookie, acid cookie, acid cookie, acid cookie, acid cookie. Avinash, 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 Avinash Rao, Avinash Rao, Avinash Rao, Avinash Rao, Avinash Rao, Avinash Rao. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, plush, 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 plush the fish. Lily, 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 Lily. That's the funniest. That's the funniest one. No, no, no. No, 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 Delaney, no, no, Delaney, don't, no. I just hurt my leg. No, Delaney, no. Delaney. That hurts so much. Oh my god. Delaney, it is 20. No. No. Was it Delaney or Laney? No, it says Delaney. Why did I reset it? No, it's fine. I was only at 200. Oh my god. Delaney, I hate you. Oh no. I'm gonna die. Is it? No. They are? I wasn't sure. No, because I have another viewer named Delaney, and like she's donated a lot in the past. Laney. Laney, 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 Laney. You are Delaney! I'm just gonna show myself out. I'll be back. I'm used to you on your other account. I got so confused. Okay, guys, stop confusing me. I'm gonna start crying. I've gone half insane. I've literally gone half insane. Delaney, 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 Delaney Rose, Delaney Rose, Delaney Rose, Delaney Rose, Delaney Rose, Delaney Rose, Laney, 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 Delaney, 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 gotcha, oh, it is the same account, gotcha. Delaney, 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 you deserve fucking mod. There you go. You deserve it after all these months. Laney, 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 Delaney, 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 Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Lily, 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 Lily. Charles, I can't end the stream. I can't. Until I hit 1,000. I'm crying. Ezzy, 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 people over, 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 people over. Thank you. This is why Stream Elements is so good. What's the point in this? To make an extra buck and an extra buck. I also saw a couple other streamers doing it, like my friends who have done it. I'm like, would you guys pay to see me go insane? You guys will. I'm gone insane. Hey, we're at back at 20 viewers, guys. You should not be watching this. You have so many other ways to be productive, but no. You want to watch Mr. Quack 22 go insane and tear the hair out of his scalp. I'm turning my fan up. I'm sweating. It's Leela. Leah. Hey, I said it like 15 times. Leah. Push. Mr. Quack. How many times have I used it to restart so far? 4 times, I think. One time I hit 960 and 2 people donated at the same time. One time I was at 500 or 450-ish. One time I was at 250 when Delaney donated. 3 then, I think. Call for support. No, I'm fine. I'm just going insane. I don't want to pass it on to you. Mr. Quack. What a way to spend my Saturday night. Mr. Quack. Hey, turn on those post notifications. There's like a little bell. End my suffering, please. Mr. Quack. Need some popcorn, Mr. Quack. Mr. Quack needs some popcorn. Mr. Quack. I so badly want to do copyright music right now because that'd make the stream way more fun, but like I don't want to get copyrighted. And anyway, Mitchell Vandermeer. Hi, welcome to the stream. Mr. Quack. You know, we're doing it. Here we go. Or did it? You can't say that, you're not even black. Mr. Quack. I can't hear anything. Is that good? Mr. Quack. My hairline? Dude, my hairline's, look at this. I got better hair than any of you guys. Yeah. Stream ends, but I have it uploaded. I could just take out the audio. I don't think people are gonna watch back this. Gotta make you understand. Mr. Quack can't end the stream. Mr. Quack wants to end the stream, but Mr. Quack can't end the stream until Mr. Quack hits 1,000. If Mr. Quack doesn't hit 1,000, Mr. Quack is gonna go insane. Mr. Quack, please, needs donations. Wait, no, he doesn't need donations, Mr. Quack. On a scale of 1 to 10, -5. Mr. Quack. I hope I'm entertaining you. I hope I'm entertaining you with my insaneness. Mr. Quack. It's 20 now to reset, so I suggest you wait until 900 something, right before 1,000. Pickleman, what's up? Mr. Beast join, that'd be funny. I would literally crap my pants, and I would yell Mr. Beast 10,000 times. Hold me to it. Mr. Quack. I'm turning it down a bit. Mr. Quack. Lily, stop. You scared me for a second. Mr. Quack. Yes, Ezzy! I know it is. Ezzy's Elzebro. However you pronounce it. I'm going insane. Ezzy. Pickleman. Lily. Mitchell. Venomir. Pickleman. Mr. Beast. Somebody PewDiePie. Mr. Quack. Sure, you can be 333. Mr. Quack. Charles, I don't need a call. I'm sorry. Mr. Quack. Leah. If you guys are watching this stream, say something in chat and I'll say your name a bunch. Mr. Quack. Push. Lily. Pickleman. Plish the fish. Charles, why? I'll check Discord. We're gonna run around and hurt Mr. Quack. Why are you calling me? Stop calling me on Discord. Why? Why do you want to call? Fine. I'll call you on Discord. Stop calling me. I'm calling you now on Discord. Oh my god. How many times are you gonna call me? Why?
Sorry,
What is... What? Okay. Why? Oh my god, he's calling me here. Hi.
I'm sorry, I can't talk right now.
What? What? Explain. Oh my god. Explain. Explain. I'm throwing my phone over there. What do you get when you put 6 ducks in a box of quack? Stop. Stop. You can't make me laugh. I'm so mad. Duck and geese, foul whip. That was funny. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. We're playing Mine Diamonds. Sorry. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. If you want before 20, Maggots and Miner, welcome to the stream, my dude. If you ever not, I don't know if you're subscribed to it, but if you're not, I suggest it because why not? Mr. Quack, 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 me, Leah. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. This guy's so obnoxious. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. God, this singer's so obnoxious. Count Tuckula. Stop. I really like this song. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Mac. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Mac. Quack, Mr. 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 Quack. Pick a man, 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 pick a man. Leo, Lily, Plish, pick a man. Maggots and Miner. You're welcome. Leo, 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 Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Far I've got to. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Vandaman, 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 Vandaman. Vandaman, 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 Vandaman. Pick a man, pick a man, pick a man, pick a man, pick a man. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Vandaman, Vandaman, Vandaman. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. No, I'm saying my name. No, no, it's better like this. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. We're halfway. I'm skipping this song, I hate it. I've heard it too much. Crab breathe. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Starts suffering more and more. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. That's me. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Lord Sky, hey! It's Lord Sky, it's Lord Sky, Lord Sky, Lord Sky, Lord Sky, it's 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 Lord Sky. It's Lord Sky. It's Lord Sky, it's Lord Sky, it's Lord Sky, it's Lord Sky, it's Mr. Quack 22, it's Mr. Quack 22, it's Mr. Quack 22. It's your boy, Mr. Quack 22. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Scissors, 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 CDK, scissors, CDK, scissors, 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 skizzers, 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 skizzers. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. I'm going insane, I'm sorry. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. I still do Minecraft streams, don't worry. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Oh, I'll miss it's Lord Sky. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Sorry. Torch UHC, 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 Torch UHC. It's Crab Rave, everyone. Try to do, can you guys do exclamation point commands? That's how you do other commands. Do those. What is Charles doing? Charles, why the heck? I joined this call for like 2 seconds. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. I don't think Discord works. No, do exclamation point commands. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. I think they'll do, or do exclamation point 8 ball, as in the number 8 and then ball. I've got a bunch of them. I'm just testing them out. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Scissors, you can do what I'm doing. Bradley Carey's dead. What? Explain? Sorry, this whole stream's a meme. We're literally listening to the biggest meme song of 2018. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Hi, Waffles. Oh, that's not a good thing. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Leave a like if you haven't already. It's literally the quickest thing. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Oh, okay, Pickle Man. That's, you know, that's okay. I don't know how to respond to that. But, Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Hyper Waffles, Plish, Pickle Man. Like the 3 most active people on stream. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Hey team watching, welcome to stream. Clay! Hey Clay, welcome back. We're still streaming. You guys all just joined. Yeah, I'm still doing this because I can't hit 1,000. You don't understand my suffering. And we're listening to All Star by Smash Mouth. Love this song. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Willie Shakes, 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 Mr. Shelly wakes. Clicking, clicking, clay, 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 clicking, 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 clicking. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Blender, 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 blender 66, 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 Mr. Quack, 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 we're getting there. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Blah blah blah. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, me and Pup. Ah! I've gone insane. I need to punch something. I don't have anything to punch. What can I punch that, like... I'm going to punch something. I need to throw something. Okay. I have a giraffe. Courtesy of Catherine, who none of you guys know except for a couple of you. That felt good. I hate this. We have to. You couldn't have done it at 9:50. Oh, it hurts so much. Only shooting stars bring the most. I lost my voice, or else I'd sing. Yeah, it's moved up to 20. We're gonna keep it at 20. I don't feel like changing it right now. 20. It's in the title, whatever. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Plish, not yet. Not yet. This is the whole song? love this. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Waffles, dude, you're the god. Thank you so much. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. I feel like I should say something else. For those that have been here for like, I've been streaming for an hour and a half doing this. Is there something else I can say? How much money have I made? I don't care right now. I want to hit 1,000. Okay, if someone resets it at 900, whatever, say 999. I'm literally I'm going to go insane. It's gonna be funny. But oof, 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 oof. That's I could do that. Oof, 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 oof. Oof, 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 Okay. Tripolowski. 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 Hadabaskosophagy. Aditaskosophagy. I'm hitting this way too much. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, somebody PewDiePie, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, 22, Mr. Quack, 22, Mr. Quack, 22, Mr. Quack, 22, Mr. Quack, 22. That makes it up. Aditaskosophagy. Tripolowski. Tripolowski. I forgot that part. Tripolowski, Tripolowski, Nani boom nani. I don't know what I'm saying. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. You recommend a song on Discord, sweet. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Yo, who won Koenig say? I don't know how to say the name, I'm sorry. Leah, what am I listening to? Stop! Okay, we'll play this on stream. Oh yeah. We're gonna play my diss track. I don't care. I'm fine with hearing my diss track as long as I'm not like with people. Oh yeah. Quack's in the house. Let's go. Derpter Cake's going down. Oh yeah. Let's go. It's every video with that Minecraft cringe flow. 400 subs in 1 month. Never, it's been done before. Behind all the competition, but Derpter Cake is next. Man, he is so fake. Call him Derpter Easy Big. And you can't win if you ain't with the crew. Your videos are trash, just accept it cause it's true. Talking crap on Discord too, but you still hit me up last night. It was 6:52, right before my curfew. My Honda Pilot 2, it is whatever o'clock. This is Quack Army, man. Try everything you can. I remember what you said, don't try to take it back. When I drop this diss track, your channel will be dead. Might as well quit YouTube cause you'll be crying in your bed. Oh wait, I forgot. Your Derpter really trash. You should stay on YouTube just to get roasted. Yeah. Just to get roasted. It's every video. It's every video. It's every video. I said it's every video. That was golden. Yeah. No, I've said it way over. No, I've said it over 1,000 times, but I reset it whenever someone donates something or whatever. So, I mean. Oh. Good song. It got reset though. I've said it almost 4,000 times. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. We're turning it up a bit. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. No, I know I've said it over 1,000 times. No, you're right, you're right. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Do I not get a round of applause for rapping my diss track? Okay, whatever. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Let me look at my phone after. Nothing. Sweet. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. I'm gonna die. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Thank you, Torch. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Trust me, guys, I never do this kind of stuff. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. 300, not bad. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Tell me I did not just open Steam. Thank you, Reese's Cups. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. 5 times. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Hey, the stream's dying. Maybe I get to 1,000. That's like the one time I'm happy it's dying. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Mr. Quack, 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 please don't do that. Mr. Quack. Sorry, I said something. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Hey, we dipped under 10. Sweet. I think we might do it. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Yeah, mute Lord Sky. Bet. Lord Sky. I don't even. How did we meet? I don't even remember. I think I remember with the present. Lord Sky, present. It's all. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Welcome back to the stream, whoever you're doing. Okay. Going a little insane. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Crisp guy, I remember him. Leo. No, I hate the muffin song. I'm a muffin, and it's muffin time. Here's a great song. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. God, Leah, this is all you've been doing. Cosmetic, how do we meet? You came to our stream less than a month ago, I believe, and you've been here ever since on Mineplex. You'll say it 50 or 100 times, probably on 600, 700. Yeah, I'm still here. People keep resetting it. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Laugh, Bowser. Plish, 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 plish. Cosmetic, 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 YT, cosmetic, YT. Cuddle, 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 cuddly, cuddly, cuddly. Cuddle, cuddle, cuddle. It's $15. 20? It's. What should we do? What number should we grow on? It has to be way more than 10. It has to be more than 10. So either 15 or 20. What do you guys think is fair? I've been here for almost 2 hours. Just tapping my spaceboard and saying Mr. Quack. 15? Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. I think 15's fair. 15. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. For $1, I'll say your name 100 times. Dabbing sucks, dabbing sucks, dabbing sucks, dabbing sucks. No, just kidding. Dabbing's great. New profile picture. I see it. Deja vu. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Leah. He's about to hit 2,000? God. So, he has to reset now? Oh no. That sucks. Sad stream. William Pugh, welcome to the stream. We're back to 15 viewers. Hey, welcome everyone. It's so sad. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, stream mods, stream mods, stream mods, stream mods, stream mods. Nuclei, 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 nuclei. Why are you coming to the stream like that, Jack? Oh my god. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Hi everyone, Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. I don't do this often though. I could be playing CS:GO, but like, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Yes, that's me. William Pugh, William Pugh, William Pugh, William Pugh, William, welcome whoever joined. Don't be shy, say hi. Give me a thumbs up if you're still watching. I'm gonna like thank every one of you. Sorry, no. I'm gonna put you all on my hit list for making me wanna end stream and end my YouTube career. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Give me a thumbs up though in chat if you're still here. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. I'm showing that. That's funny. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Wrong finger, dude. Yeah, wrong finger. Gotcha. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. It's fun though. I'm losing my breath. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, thank you for all the thumbs up. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. We're almost at 1,000. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. I mean, hey, you want a less productive way than CS:GO? Watching my stream is being less productive than playing CS:GO. What cosmetic is? Whatever. LA, yeah, I am. I can't hit 1,000. People keep donating. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Mr. Quack, 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 cosmetic, Aleo. My headphones are about to die, and they were full. They died for like 2 hours. Here, anything, all my mods, like whenever someone says anything, unless it's like extremely offensive, just show it. So like that's fine. It's just funny. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Let me Despacito. Oh, it's Despacito 3 official Minecraft parody. Oh my god. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Yeah, subscribe today, because why not? And because your name pops up, it's lit. Do it. CS:GO is really fun. Oh, bye. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Waffle's gone, so I don't know who's going to reset it. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Who wants to be 66? First one in chat. Push. 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 Push, 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 push. Thank you, the software. Quirkbot. William, CSGO, Nuclei, LZ, Ezzy, Lord Sky, Waff, Bowser, Nuclei, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Just let me do this, please. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. I want to change my YouTube name after this. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. We're getting close to 1,000. Minecraft Cedo. Why can no one buy my merch? I've wondered why. Cedo, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack 22, 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 Mr. Quack 22. Call me some slack, please. Mr. Quack 22, Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. You wouldn't, William. That's mean. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Oh, cool. I'll have to. Well, is anyone gonna buy the merch though? Tell me right now if anyone on stream wants to buy merch. Just tell me now, or else I'm just gonna take it off until like I'm actually in a live channel again. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Peep, I wanna. Are you guys doing the 5v5 yet? I wanna end soon. I have a feeling. Mr. Quack body pills. You said that earlier. I forgot to respond to that. I don't know. Oh, feck, don't do this to me. Zero feck. What? Energizer MC? Yes, it is. Good, you're broke. It's tomorrow. Are you playing SCP? Well, we can do comp later if you want. I don't know. I can join you in SCP. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Hey, Lay's still here. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. You're that nerfter. Gotcha, my guy. Nuclear Energizer MC, Energizer MC, Energizer MC. That nerfer. People over. The fact. Zero fact. Go fact. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Welcome to the stream. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Yeah, it's been Draken. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. I might have missed one. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Monkey legs. That's funny. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Guys, we're almost at 1,000. I'm so happy. I'm gonna be so happy because I know we're gonna hit 1,000. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Energizer. I don't even know anymore. I haven't kept track. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. It didn't count them. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Hey, it's running in the 90s. Heck yeah. We're about to hit it. It's 15 for a reset. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. I'll take 10 though. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. This is a perfect song for this. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Yeah, it is. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. No. Love it. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. I'm gonna do it quick. We have 60 left. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Yeah, I'll be mad. I'll just be so sad. I'll probably cry on stream. Mr. Quack, 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 Mr. Quack. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack 22, 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 guys, I'm gonna get Mr. Quack 22, Mr. Quack 22, Mr. Quack 22, Mr. Quack 22, MED Reaper, you're trash, Mr. Quack 22, what? What's your question? What's the question? Mr. Quack 22, Mr. Quack 22. Oh, he's trying to stall you. Mr. Quack 22, 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 Mr. Quack 22. What's the question? What's your question? Mr. Quack 22? Mr. Quack 22, what's your legit question? What? Mr. Quack 22, 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 Mr. Quack 22. We did it! Oh, we're finished. No one wanted to reset. GG. Was anyone gonna reset it? Did I not say? Mr. Quack 22. Mr. Quack 22, Mr. Quack 22, Mr. Quack 22, Mr. Quack 22, Mr. Quack 22. Guys, we did it! Oh my god. Was anyone gonna donate though? Mr. Quack. Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack, Mr. Quack. Shut up. Shut up! Oh, I didn't have Push help me. That's fine. I'm just so tired. Guys, we hit it. God. Okay, I'm ending the stream now. That 2 hours of me saying Mr. Quack. Everything hurts. Waffles, you weren't here to stop me. Waffles, you weren't here to stop me. Alright, that's the end of the stream. Hope you all enjoyed. Leah, you wasted 2 hours of your life on this. You're gonna look back and be like, my life was so short, it went by so quickly because you were watching this. Nuclear, oh my god. Thank you, Waffles. Okay, bye everyone. Have a good day. Yeah, I did.